The research vessel Aurora cut through the Pacific waters like a blade, its hull gleaming under the harsh midday sun. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stood at the bow, his weathered face creased with concentration as he studied the sonar readings for the 100th time. 20 years of marine archaeology hadn't prepared him for what they'd discovered in the Mariana Trench. A submarine that shouldn't exist. Dr. Pierce, Isabella Reyes, his chief technical officer, burst onto the deck, tablet in hand. The ROVs picked up something new. You need to see this. Her dark eyes sparkled with the same mixture of excitement and unease that had gripped the entire crew since they'd first detected the anomaly 3 days ago. In the ship's cramped control room, Commander James Walsh leaned over the main console, his military bearing at odds with the civilian research vessel. The remote-operated vehicle's feed flickered across the primary screen, showing the impossible. A World War II-era submarine resting on a ledge that, according to all geological surveys, shouldn't exist. "It's the U.S. Harbinger," Walsh said, his voice tight. "Has to be." She disappeared in 43, taking her entire crew with her. But this, he gestured at the depth readings. This is impossible. No sub from that era could have reached these depths. The Harbinger lay perfectly preserved, as if it had been sealed in amber rather than crushing oceanic pressures. No rust marred its hull. No barnacles clung to its surface. Instead, a faint luminescence seemed to pulse beneath its metal skin, like a heartbeat frozen in time. "The energy readings are off the charts," Isabella muttered, fingers dancing across her tablet. "It's like it's generating its own electromagnetic field. But that's not even the strangest part." She looked up, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "According to these readings, the submarine exists in a state of quantum uncertainty. It's simultaneously here and somewhere else." Commander Walsh snorted. "That's impossible. It's either here or it isn't." "The laws of physics seem to disagree," Isabella replied, pulling up a complex wave pattern on the main screen. "See these oscillations? They're identical to theoretical models of temporal displacement. This submarine isn't just lost in space, it's lost in time." Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine despite the control room's warmth. He'd led dozens of expeditions, uncovered countless wrecks, but nothing like this. The Harbinger wasn't just another war relic, it was a mystery that defied explanation. "We need to get closer," he decided, ignoring the warning look from Walsh. "Prepare the deep submergence vehicle. I want eyes on that hull." "With all due respect, Doctor," Walsh interjected, "we should wait for backup. Something about this feels wrong." But Nathaniel was already moving, his mind made up. "That sub's been waiting 80 years to tell its story, Commander. I don't intend to make it wait any longer." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of preparation. The DSV Nautilus, their primary research submersible, was checked and rechecked. Isabella insisted on upgrading its sensors to better monitor the strange energy emissions from the Harbinger, while Walsh drilled the backup protocols into the support crew. As Nathaniel suited up, he caught his reflection in the DSV's viewport. Gray had crept into his temples, lines carved deeper around his eyes, but the same burning curiosity that had driven him since childhood still blazed in his gaze. This discovery could change everything they thought they knew about physics, about time itself. The descent began in silence. Isabella's voice crackled through the calm as the Nautilus dropped through layers of increasingly hostile ocean. Passing 8,000 meters, hull integrity holding steady. Energy readings from the target are intensifying. Through the viewport, Nathaniel watched the absolute darkness part before the DSV's lights. The water here had never known sunlight, never felt anything but the endless pressure of miles of ocean above. Yet somehow, the Harbinger had survived here, unchanged, unaging. At 10,000 meters, they saw it. The submarine's hull gleamed as if newly forged, the metal unmarred by decades of submersion. But as they drew closer, Nathaniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. The metal seemed to ripple, like heat waves over hot asphalt, and through those ripples, he caught glimpses of Something else. The same submarine, but different. Sometimes pristine, sometimes battle-scared, sometimes barely more than a skeleton of twisted metal. "Are you seeing this?" he breathed into the calm. "Affirmative," Isabella replied, her voice tight with tension. "The quantum fluctuations are increasing. It's like we're seeing multiple versions of the same submarine, overlaid on each other." The Nautilus's instruments began to whine, their displays flickering with interference. Through the distortion, Nathaniel could make out movement within the Harbinger's hull, shadows passing behind viewports that shouldn't have survived the pressure, lights blinking in patterns that made his eyes hurt to follow. "Dr. Pierce," Walsh's voice cut through the static, "we're picking up a transmission. It's coming from the Harbinger." Before Nathaniel could respond, a sound filled the DSV's cabin, a sound that shouldn't have been possible at these depths. Through layers of static and distortion, a voice spoke, as clear as if its owner stood beside him. "Day 29,219. This is Captain Marcus Reynolds of the U.S. Harbinger. We are trapped. Time isn't working right. The experiment. We never should have. God help us, we're still here. We're always here. We're always dying." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence heavier than the ocean around them. Nathaniel stared at the submarine, his mind struggling to process what he'd heard. 29,219 days. 80 years, trapped in this impossible place, dying but never dead. "Take us closer," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Pierce," Isabella warned, "the energy readings are becoming unstable." "We should." "Closer," he insisted. The Nautilus edged forward, its lights illuminating the Harbinger's hull in stark detail. And there, etched into the metal as if carved yesterday, Nathaniel saw words that made his heart stop. "Abandon hope, for time has abandoned us first." The mystery of the U.S. Harbinger was just beginning to unfold, and as the Nautilus hovered in that lightless depth, Nathaniel Pierce realized they had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than a simple missing submarine. They had found a tear in reality itself, and whatever lay on the other side had been waiting a very, very long time for visitors. The research vessel Aurora cut through the Pacific waters like a blade, its hull gleaming under the harsh midday sun. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stood at the bow, his weathered face creased with concentration as he studied the sonar readings for the 100th time. 20 years of marine archaeology hadn't prepared him for what they'd discovered in the Mariana Trench. A submarine that shouldn't exist. Dr. Pierce, Isabella Reyes, his chief technical officer, burst onto the deck, tablet in hand. "The ROV's picked up something new. You need to see this." Her dark eyes sparkled with the same mixture of excitement and unease that had gripped the entire crews since they'd first detected the anomaly 3 days ago. In the ship's cramped control room, Commander James Walsh leaned over the main console, his military bearing at odds with the civilian research vessel. The remote-operated vehicle's feed flickered across the primary screen, showing the impossible. A World War I-era submarine resting on a ledge that, according to all geological surveys, shouldn't exist. "It's the U.S. Harbinger," Walsh said, his voice tight. "Has to be. She disappeared in 43, taking her entire crew with her. But this," he gestured at the depth readings, "this is impossible. No sub from that era could have reached these depths." The Harbinger lay perfectly preserved, as if it had been sealed in amber rather than crushing oceanic pressures. No rust marred its hull. No barnacles clung to its surface. Instead, a faint luminescence seemed to pulse beneath its metal skin, like a heartbeat frozen in time. "The energy readings are off the charts," Isabella muttered, fingers dancing across her tablet. "It's like it's generating its own electromagnetic field. But that's not even the strangest part." She looked up, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "According to these readings, the submarine exists in a state of quantum uncertainty. It's simultaneously here and somewhere else." Commander Walsh snorted. That's impossible. It's either here or it isn't. The laws of physics seem to disagree, Isabella replied, pulling up a complex wave pattern on the main screen. See these oscillations. They're identical to theoretical models of temporal displacement. This submarine isn't just lost in space, it's lost in time. Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine despite the control room's warmth. He'd led dozens of expeditions, uncovered countless wrecks, but nothing like this. The Harbinger wasn't just another war relic. It was a mystery that defied explanation. We need to get closer, he decided, ignoring the warning look from Walsh. Prepare the deep submergence vehicle. I want eyes on that hull. With all due respect, Doctor, Walsh interjected, we should wait for backup. Something about this feels wrong. But Nathaniel was already moving, his mind made up. That sub's been waiting 80 years to tell its story, Commander. I don't intend to make it wait any longer. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of preparation. The DSV Nautilus, their primary research submersible, was checked and rechecked. Isabella insisted on upgrading its sensors to better monitor the strange energy emissions from the Harbinger, while Walsh drilled the backup protocols into the support crew. As Nathaniel suited up, he caught his reflection in the DSV's viewport. Gray had crept into his temples, lines carved deeper around his eyes, but the same burning curiosity that had driven him since childhood still blazed in his gaze. This discovery could change everything they thought they knew about physics, about time itself. The descent began in silence. Isabella's voice crackled through the comm as the Nautilus dropped through layers of increasingly hostile ocean. Passing 8,000 meters, hull integrity holding steady. Energy readings from the target are intensifying. Through the viewport, Nathaniel watched the absolute darkness part before the DSV's lights. The water here had never known sunlight, never felt anything but the endless pressure of miles of ocean above. Yet somehow, the Harbinger had survived here, unchanged, unaging. At 10,000 meters, they saw it. The submarine's hull gleamed as if newly forged, the metal unmarred by decades of submersion. But as they drew closer, Nathaniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. The metal seemed to ripple, like heat waves over hot asphalt, and through those ripples, he caught glimpses of something else. The same submarine, but different, sometimes pristine, sometimes battle-scared, sometimes barely more than a skeleton of twisted metal. Are you seeing this? He breathed into the comm. Affirmative, Isabella replied, her voice tight with tension. The quantum fluctuations are increasing. It's like we're seeing multiple versions of the same submarine, overlaid on each other. The Nautilus's instruments began to whine, their displays flickering with interference. Through the distortion, Nathaniel could make out movement within the Harbinger's hull, shadows passing behind viewports that shouldn't have survived the pressure, lights blinking in patterns that made his eyes hurt to follow. Dr. Pierce, Walsh's voice cut through the static. We're picking up a transmission. It's coming from the Harbinger. Before Nathaniel could respond, a sound filled the DSV's cabin, a sound that shouldn't have been possible at these depths. Through layers of static and distortion, a voice spoke, as clear as if its owner stood beside him. Day 29,219. This is Captain Marcus Reynolds of the U.S. Harbinger. We are trapped. Time isn't working right. The experiment. We never should have. God help us. We're still here. We're always here. We're always dying. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence heavier than the ocean around them. Nathaniel stared at the submarine, his mind struggling to process what he'd heard. 29,219 days. 80 years, trapped in this impossible place, dying but never dead. Take us closer, he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Pierce, Isabella warned, the energy readings are becoming unstable. We should. Closer, he insisted. The Nautilus edged forward, its lights illuminating the Harbinger's hull in stark detail. And there, etched into the metal as if carved yesterday. Nathaniel saw words that made his heart stop. Abandon hope, for time has abandoned us first. The mystery of the U.S. Harbinger was just beginning to unfold, and as the Nautilus hovered in that lightless depth, Nathaniel Pierce realized they had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than a simple missing submarine. They had found a tear in reality itself, and whatever lay on the other side had been waiting a very, very long time for visitors. Depths of deception. The decision to board the Harbinger came at dawn, after 18 hours of heated debate. Commander Walsh had argued against it, citing every regulation in the book, but in the end, the impossible readings from Isabella's instruments won out. Something inside that submarine was rewriting the laws of physics, and they needed to know why. Final equipment check, Isabella announced, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. She stood in the Aurora's prep room, surrounded by specialized gear designed for deep-sea exploration. The suits have been modified to withstand the temporal distortions, but we don't know how effective they'll be. If the readings spike, we abort immediately. Nathaniel nodded, watching as Professor Richard Blackwood, their quantum physicist, made final adjustments to a device he called a temporal anchor. The weathered Scottish scientist had been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd detected the first transmission from the Harbinger. The anchor should keep us tethered to our own time stream, Blackwood explained, his accent thickening with stress. But these readings, they're unlike anything in theoretical physics. The Harbinger isn't just displaced in time. It's experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. The team suited up in silence. Besides Nathaniel, Isabella, and Blackwood, they'd selected Lieutenant Maria Torres, a Navy specialist with deep-sea rescue experience, and Dr. Victor Zhao, their medical officer. 5 people to unravel an 80-year-old mystery that defied explanation. The Nautilus's descent felt different this time. The darkness pressed closer, and strange lights danced at the edge of vision. Auroral displays that shouldn't exist at these depths. When they reached the Harbinger, Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. The submarine's hull rippled with that same otherworldly energy, but now he could see patterns in the distortions, like waves of possibility washing over the metal. Temporal anchor holding steady, Blackwood reported as they positioned the Nautilus alongside a cargo hatch. But the readings, they're getting stronger. Whatever's causing this, we're getting closer to its source. Lieutenant Torres operated the Nautilus's mechanical arm with surgical precision, matching the sub's pressure with the Harbinger's impossible bubble of preserved space. The hatch opened with a groan that seemed to echo across decades. Remember, Walsh's voice crackled through their comms. At the first sign of trouble, you get out. That's an order. They crossed the threshold one by one, their helmet lights cutting through darkness that felt alive. The interior of the Harbinger was pristine, showing none of the decay expected after 80 years underwater. But something was wrong. The corridors seemed to shift as they walked, subtle changes in geometry that made Nathaniel's head hurt if he looked too long. The temporal distortions are stronger here, Isabella murmured, studying her instruments. It's like we're walking through layers of time. They found the first body in the control room. A young sailor, perfectly preserved, frozen in the act of reaching for a control panel. But as they watched, his form flickered like a bad transmission, showing glimpses of different states, sometimes whole, sometimes decayed, sometimes nothing but bones. My God, Dr. Zhou breathed, scanning the figure with trembling hands. He's not dead. Not exactly. His biological readings, they're cycling. He's caught in some kind of loop, living and dying over and over. Blackwood's temporal anchor began to whine, the fields becoming unstable. These readings, they're astronomical. Whatever's causing this, it's coming from deeper in the submarine. They pressed on, moving through corridors that seemed to breathe with temporal energy. Every crew member they found was trapped in the same horrific cycle. Living, dying, living again. Some reached out to them with pleading eyes, their mouths moving in silent screams that echoed across time. The ship's log, when they found it, told a story that chilled them to the bone. Captain Reynolds had been carrying more than a crew when the Harbinger disappeared. They'd been transporting a device, something the log called Project Kronos, a weapon designed to manipulate time itself. "Listen to this," Nathaniel said, reading from the captain's final entry. "The device was unstable from the start. We knew the risks, but orders were orders. When it activated, God help us, we broke something. Time itself shattered around us. We can see them now, all our possible deaths, all happening at once. There is no escape. There is only the eternal moment of our dying." A scream cut through their comms. Lieutenant Torres, who'd moved ahead to scout the next compartment. They found her frozen, staring through a viewport into the submarine's research lab. Inside, reality itself seemed to tear apart, colors and shapes that shouldn't exist twisting around a device that pulsed with terrible purpose. "The Project Kronos device," Blackwood whispered, his face pale behind his helmet visor. "It's still active, still trying to complete its function, but it's trapped in a feedback loop, drawing power from the crew's perpetual dying. We need to shut it down," Isabella said, already moving toward the lab door. But Nathaniel grabbed her arm. "Look," he pointed. Through the temporal distortions, they could see figures moving in the lab, the same scene playing out over and over. Scientists activating the device, their faces transforming from triumph to horror as reality fractured around them. And behind them, through another viewport, something else, a glimpse of sunshine, of the surface world, of the moment before the Harbinger began its fatal dive. It's a window, Nathaniel realized, not just to the past, but to the moment this all began. If we can reach it. The temporal anchor screamed a warning. Reality rippled around them. And for a moment, Nathaniel saw himself reflected in the viewport, not as he was, but as he could be. Older, younger, living, dead, all existing simultaneously. "The field is collapsing," Blackwood shouted. "We need to leave now." But Nathaniel couldn't move. Through the chaos of fractured time, he saw Captain Reynolds standing in the lab, staring back at him. The captain's lips moved, forming words that echoed through 80 years of trapped time. The temporal anchor's warning shriek filled their helmets as reality buckled around them. Nathaniel Pierce braced himself against a bulkhead that felt both ancient and newly forged, watching as wave after wave of temporal distortion washed through the Harbinger's corridors. "The device is reaching critical mass," Professor Blackwood shouted over the comm. His temporal anchor sparked and sputtered, fighting against forces it was never designed to contain. "These readings, it's as if time itself is trying to correct a paradox." Isabella Rice worked frantically at her tablet, her fingers dancing across calculations that rewrote themselves as fast as she could input them. "The Project Kronos device isn't just malfunctioning," she said, her voice tight with revelation. "It's trying to resolve every possible timeline simultaneously, each timeline where the crew dies. It's feeding back into the system, creating more energy, more possibilities." Dr. Zhou's medical scanner whirred as he studied the frozen form of a young engineer, caught eternally between heartbeats. The cellular decay patterns are impossible. These men, they're experiencing every possible death at once, but also every possible moment of being alive. It's like they're quantum-locked in a state of perpetual existence. Through the viewport, Nathaniel watched as the Project Kronos device pulsed with increasing intensity. Each flash illuminated the research lab in strobes of possibility, sometimes filled with desperate scientists, sometimes empty save for skeletal remains, sometimes showing glimpses of realities too alien to comprehend. "We need to access those research logs," Nathaniel decided, forcing himself to focus despite the temporal chaos around them. "Lieutenant Torres, can you get us into that lab?" Maria Torres studied the sealed doorway, her military training warring with the impossible physics before her. "The locking mechanism is cycling through different states, if we time it right." She reached for the control panel, her movements precise despite their protective suit's bulk. The door shuddered open with a groan that echoed across decades. Inside, the air itself seemed to ripple with temporal energy. Banks of equipment lined the walls, some pristine, some corroded, all existing in a quantum superposition of states. "Look at this," Isabella called out, her light falling on a journal bound in cracked leather. As they watched, the pages flickered between pristine and decayed, but the words remained legible. Project Cronus Test Log, Day 1. The theoretical framework is sound. By creating a controlled temporal field, we can give our submarines the ultimate advantage: the ability to exist slightly out of sync with normal time. Imagine vessels that could see attacks before they happen, that could traverse temporal shortcuts through the ocean depths. Day 15. First successful microtest. Generated a field that displaced a water sample by 3.2 seconds. Some concern about power consumption and field stability, but Command insists we proceed. Day 23. Something's wrong. The field isn't collapsing properly after tests. Dr. Werner swears he saw himself working at his station hours before he arrived. Jenkins found his coffee cup half full when he knows he finished it. Final entry. God help us all. The field is spreading, feeding on itself. Time isn't just bending anymore. It's shattering. I can see every mistake we could have made, every death we might die. The crew, they're screaming across 1,000 timelines. We're trapped in our own eternal moment, and there's no way to. The entry ended in a scrawl that twisted off the page. But there was something else. Notes in different handwriting. Calculations that seemed to blur and shift as Nathaniel tried to read them. "These equations," Blackwood muttered, studying the pages through his helmet visor. "They're brilliant and absolutely mad. They weren't just trying to manipulate time. They were trying to weaponize causality itself, create a bubble where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, allowing their submarine to—" He never finished the sentence. With a sound like reality tearing, the Project Cronus device flared to blinding intensity. Through the temporal distortions, Nathaniel saw figures moving in the lab, ghost images of the original research team, their faces masks of horror as they realized what they'd unleashed. "The containment field is failing," Isabella shouted, her instruments screaming warnings. "The device. It's trying to resolve all possible timelines at once." The walls of the Harbinger groaned, metal stressed by forces it was never meant to endure. Through the viewports, Nathaniel could see the ocean outside changing. Sometimes modern and dark, sometimes filled with the wakes of World War I battles, sometimes showing glimpses of futures that mankind was never meant to witness. "We need to shut it down," Nathaniel said, taking a step toward the pulsing device. But Dr. Joe grabbed his arm. "Look at the crew," the medical officer whispered. On every surface, in every corner, the trapped sailors of the Harbinger flickered through their eternal moments. But something was changing. Their expressions shifted from horror to hope. Lieutenant Torres's voice cut through the chaos. "The temporal anchor. It's creating a stable point in their loop. We're not just observers anymore. We're becoming part of their timeline." Professor Blackwood's face went pale behind his visor. "Of course, the anchor isn't just protecting us. It's providing a fixed reference point in space-time. But that means we're their way out," Isabella finished, her eyes wide with understanding. "Or we're about to join them in their eternal hell." The Project Cronus device pulsed again, and this time, Nathaniel heard something else beneath the temporal distortions. Voices, thousands of them, all overlapping. The trapped crew of the Harbinger, speaking across 80 years of frozen time. "Help us. End this. Please. Every moment. Dying. Living. Can't escape. Help. Help. Help." And then, cutting through the cacophony, a single voice. Captain Reynolds, but not the version trapped in the loop. This was something else, something that existed between the moments of time itself. "You don't understand yet. You can't. But you will. Time isn't just broken here. It's aware. And it's hungry. The temporal anchor screamed a final warning as reality began to fold in on itself. The team had minutes, maybe seconds, to make a choice that would echo across every possible timeline. Try to save the Harbinger's crew, or save themselves from becoming part of the eternal moment. And in the depths of the Mariana Trench, where pressure and darkness ruled supreme, time itself held its breath, waiting to see what they would choose. Time fractured around them like breaking glass. Nathaniel Pierce watched in horror as reality itself seemed to peel away, revealing layers of possibility beneath. The Harbinger's hull groaned with the weight of 80 years of compressed moments, all trying to happen at once. The temporal anchors failing. Professor Blackwood shouted, his Scottish accent thick with panic. The device in his hand sparked and wheezed, fighting against forces it was never designed to contain. We've got minutes at most before we're pulled into their loop. Isabella's fingers flew across her tablet, streams of data flowing faster than human eyes could follow. The Project Cronus device, it's not just manipulating time anymore. It's creating a kind of temporal singularity. Every possible moment of the Harbinger's existence is being drawn into a single point. Through the chaos, Lieutenant Torres maintained her military bearing, though her voice trembled slightly. We need to move. Now. Either we find a way to shut that thing down, or we evacuate before. She never finished the sentence. With a sound like 1,000 screaming souls, the Project Cronus device unleashed a wave of temporal energy that swept through the submarine. Nathaniel felt it pass through him like Arctic wind, and suddenly he was seeing everything. He saw himself as a child, as an old man, as a corpse. He saw versions of himself that had never existed. A soldier, a priest, a murderer. Each possibility was equally real, equally present, all happening in the same eternal moment. Through the confusion, he heard Dr. Joe's terrified voice. My God, it's happening to us. We're being quantum locked just like the original crew. The medical officer was right. All around them, reality was splitting into layers. Nathaniel watched as multiple versions of his team overlapped and separated, each making different choices, each leading to different outcomes. In one timeline, they were already dead, their bodies floating lifeless in the crushing depths. In another, they had never come to the Harbinger at all. The anchor. Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. Focus on the anchor. It's our only reference point in real time. Nathaniel forced his attention to the sputtering device, using it as a lifeline to pull his consciousness back to a single moment. Around him, his team did the same, fighting against the temporal tides that threatened to scatter them across infinity. Isabella, he managed, his voice strained. The device, can we shut it down? She shook her head, her form flickering between states of existence. Not directly. It's become self-sustaining. The energy from all these trapped moments, it's feeding back into itself, creating a closed loop that's getting stronger with each iteration. Then we break the loop, Lieutenant Torres said firmly. She pointed to the viewport, where they could see the original research team frozen in their moment of realization. We stop them from activating the device in the first place. That's impossible, Blackwood protested. We can't change the past without creating a paradox that would. He stopped, his eyes widening behind his visor. Unless, that's what's supposed to happen. What if we're not just observers? What if we're part of the original timeline? The idea hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Through the temporal distortions, he could see new possibilities unfolding. The Project Cronus device hadn't just trapped the Harbinger's crew. It had created a loop waiting to be closed. They weren't here by accident. They were here because they had always been here, would always be here, had to be here to complete the circle. But before they could act on this revelation, another temporal wave hit. This one was different. Not just chaotic energy, but something focused, something conscious. The voice they heard wasn't Captain Reynolds anymore. It was older, colder, a thing that existed in the spaces between moments. There is no escape. It resonated through their minds. Time is not a riviere to be dmmet. It is an ocean, and I am at its tide. Your attempts to control it AAV OMNLGIV in it, T OMNCIOUSSNES, aware in ES, hunger. The entity's presence was overwhelming. Through its eyes, Nathaniel saw the truth. Project Cronus hadn't just broken time. It had awakened something that had always existed in the quantum foam of reality. Something that had been waiting, watching, feeding on the infinite possibilities of human choice. The device, Isabella gasped, fighting against the entity's influence. It's not just a machine. It's a door. And something came through. Dr. Zhao's medical scanner wailed. Our cellular structure, it's destabilizing. We're being quantum shifted just like the original crew. If we don't act now. The choice crystallized in Nathaniel's mind with terrible clarity. They could try to escape, leaving the Harbinger's crew to their eternal torment. They could attempt to destroy the device, possibly annihilating themselves and the original crew in the process. Or they could attempt something far more dangerous, use the temporal chaos to their advantage, find the moment of the device's activation, and try to change not just the past, but the nature of causality itself. Through the viewport, Captain Reynolds' trapped form seemed to stare directly at him. In that gaze, Nathaniel saw 80 years of waiting, of dying, of living, all compressed into a single eternal moment. And he understood. This wasn't just about saving the crew anymore. It was about facing something that had existed since the beginning of time, something that had been awakened by humanity's hubris, something that would never stop hunting once it had tasted the infinite possibilities of human consciousness. The temporal anchor gave one final desperate whine before going dark. Reality began to dissolve around them, the boundaries between moments becoming increasingly fluid. They had seconds left before they would be drawn into the loop forever, becoming just another set of possibilities in the eternal moment of the Harbinger's dying. In that final instant of clarity, Nathaniel Pierce made his choice, one that would echo across every possible timeline, every potential reality, every moment that was or could be. The consequences would reshape not just their fate, but the very nature of time itself. In the moment between moments, as reality shuddered around them, Nathaniel Pierce understood what needed to be done. The temporal entity hadn't just been awakened by Project Cronus. It had been waiting for this moment across eons, using humanity's ambition as a key to unlock its prison in quantum space. Isabella, he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. The device isn't creating these temporal effects. It's focusing them, like a lens. She nodded, her form flickering between states of existence. The calculations in the journal, they weren't just about time manipulation. They were building a bridge between dimensions. Which means we can use it, Professor Blackwood interjected, his eyes bright with sudden understanding. Not to change the past, but to redirect the temporal energy, create a feedback loop within a feedback loop. Lieutenant Torres steadied herself against a console that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. In English, Professor, what are you suggesting? We're going to turn their trap into a prison, Nathaniel explained, the plan crystallizing in his mind. Not for the crew, for the entity itself. Dr. Zhao's medical scanner pulsed with warning lights. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast. Our quantum signatures are becoming unstable. 5 minutes, maybe less, before we're permanently merged with the time stream. The entity must have sensed their intentions. The air itself seemed to vibrate with its rage, and its voice echoed through their minds like breaking glass. Foolish creatures, you cannot KG time, ATC Elif. I have EXISTDDCNC TAE first moment of creation. I will exist. ANTAL TAE last stayar BURNs out. That's where you're wrong, Nathaniel shot back, moving toward the Project Cronus device. You're not time itself. You're a parasite feeding on temporal energy. And parasites can be contained. Isabella was already working, her fingers dancing across calculations that rewrote themselves in real time. If we can invert the device's quantum field, create a temporal Mobius strip, the entity would be trapped in its own loop. Blackwood finished, his voice tight with excitement, feeding on itself instead of the crew's timeline. They worked with desperate speed, fighting against the dissolution of reality itself. Through the temporal distortions, Nathaniel could see the original research team, still frozen in their moment of horror. But now he noticed something else, subtle changes in their expressions, as if they were becoming aware of what was happening. "Captain Reynolds," he called out, hoping his voice would reach across the decades. "If you can hear me, we need your help. Your crew's timeline. It's the anchor point. The moment everything changed." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, Reynolds' form began to move. Not the flickering movement they'd seen before, but real, purposeful motion. The captain's eyes met Nathaniel's, and his voice came through clear despite 80 years of separation. "We've been waiting. Every moment, every death, every possibility. We knew someone would come. Someone had to come. The circle demands it." The entity's rage intensified, temporal energy lashing out like whips of lightning. Dr. Zhao was thrown across the lab, his suit's integrity alarm screaming. Lieutenant Torres moved to help him, but her form split into multiple versions, each taking a different path. "Focus," Blackwood shouted. "Use the anchor point. Remember who you are, when you are." Isabella's voice cut through the chaos. "The calculations are ready, but we need more power. The device can't generate enough energy to create the inversion field." "It doesn't have to," Nathaniel realized. "The entity itself will provide the power. Its own hunger will be its undoing." He turned to the trapped crew, their forms now more solid, more present. "Captain, on my mark, initiate your original sequence. Exactly as you did before." "You'll die," Torres protested. "All of us, the entire crew, will be caught in the backwash." "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "We'll be exactly where we need to be, where we've always been." The entity's presence pressed against their minds, trying to scatter their thoughts across infinite timelines. But Nathaniel held firm, focused on this moment, this choice, this possibility. "Now," he commanded. Everything happened at once. Captain Reynolds and his crew, moving in perfect synchronization with memories 80 years old, activated the Project Cronus device. Isabella initiated her inverted quantum field. Blackwood's temporal anchor, though dead, provided the geometric framework they needed. The entity screamed, a sound that existed in all possible frequencies simultaneously. Reality buckled as temporal energy cascaded through the lab. But this time it was different. Instead of scattering across infinite possibilities, the energy curved back on itself, creating a perfect loop. Nathaniel watched in awe as the entity was drawn into its own recursive trap. Every attempt it made to escape only strengthened the field, creating an eternal moment that existed outside of normal space-time, a prison made of its own nature. The Harbinger shuddered as timeline after timeline collapsed, resolving into a single, stable reality. The trapped crew members flickered and solidified, their expressions changing from horror to confusion to relief. They were no longer dying in every possible way. They simply were. "It's done," Isabella whispered, checking her readings. "The temporal field is stable, self-sustaining." "But how are we still here?" Torres asked, looking at her hands as if expecting them to dissolve. "If we changed the past." "We didn't change anything," Blackwood explained, his voice filled with wonder. "This was always how it happened. The entity was trapped because we trapped it. We came here because we had already come here. The loop isn't just closed. It never existed in the first place." Dr. Zhao's medical scanner hummed as he checked the crew's life signs. "They're stabilizing, quantum signatures returning to normal. It's as if the past 80 years never happened." Captain Reynolds finished, stepping forward. He looked both young and ancient, a man who had experienced eternity and returned. And happened eternally. Both. Neither. Time isn't what we thought it was. The entity's presence was still there, but muted now, trapped in its endless recursive prison. Its anger had turned to something else, perhaps understanding, perhaps acceptance of its role in a greater pattern of reality. As emergency crews from the Aurora began the long process of recovering the Harbinger and its crew, Nathaniel stood at the viewport, watching the play of light through the quantum-stabilized waters. The submarine would be studied, of course. Project Kronos would be dismantled, its secrets carefully contained. But he knew the true story would never be told, could never be told. How do you explain that time itself had consciousness? That reality was saved by creating a paradox that wasn't a paradox. That some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only experienced and remembered. The Harbinger rose slowly through the depths, carrying its cargo of impossibilities. And in the quantum spaces between moments, in a prison built of recursive time, an entity that had once thought itself a god contemplated the ingenuity of the beings that had trapped it. Perhaps, in its eternal moment, it finally understood what made humans different from cosmic forces, not their mastery of time and space, but their ability to accept that some things were beyond mastery. The ocean depths grew lighter as they ascended, leaving behind the darkness where the Harbinger had waited for 80 years, that both had and hadn't happened. And in every possible timeline, in every potential reality, the story of the ghost submarine that defied time itself became part of the greater mystery of existence, a reminder that some questions were best left as questions, their answers hidden in the spaces between moments, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out.